this video, the middle-aged nerds discuss spoilers from books they read decades ago. Do you really need a spoiler alert? Do you really?
Hi, welcome to Non-Terrestrial Half-Life. We're this YouTube show that rereads books we read in the first half of our life to see how they hold up as we're middle-aged. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing good. I'm Bill, also known as Matt Stagger, pretty much everywhere in the Wheel of Time community, as that's one of my favorite books. With us today is Dr. Chase. Dr. Chase, if you'd like to tell us about your YouTube channel and your special upcoming news.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Philip Chase, and I run a YouTube channel that is dedicated to exploring fantasy. So I am one of the major reasons, honestly, I'm a fantasy fan at all is because of Ursula Guin's Earthsea series. So it's definitely a very formative influence for me.
Well, when you said that this would be a topic you'd love to discuss on our show, I was like, perfect, because it was one of the books that before we even decided to do the channel, I was thinking of rereading because I literally haven't read this since I was 9 years old.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's 40 years.
And I was 13.
And
so
yeah, I only had vague recollections of these books. And to me, it's always been a trilogy, even though she put out 2 books later on. Yeah. I think it's 2 books. So I haven't read those. So I'm
and a bunch of short stories too. Yeah.
That's what Bill was telling me.
Yeah. I came across a couple short stories she wrote that were published in 1964 in a fantasy magazine, all based in Earthsea. They were, I got synopsises of them. I couldn't find the actual stories, so I'm looking for those. Because
I might be able to help you with that.
This book really got me reinvested. I didn't remember much. I remembered the basics of Earthsea, but this really drew me in even more as an adult, I think, than it did as a child, which is weird. It's usually the opposite. So
that makes sense to me. That makes sense to me, Bill, because I feel like these books have the Earthsea books in general are even though they were, I think, marketed to kids originally. There's so much in here that is at a level that is very adult as well.
It's packed.
It's packed. Yeah.
I can't believe how much she packed into that tiny little book.
Yeah.
And I was reading something she wrote. I think it was the introduction for the illustrated edition, but she said she was actually specifically approached to write children's novel.
Yeah.
And that's what she was asked to write. And at first she wasn't going to do it. And finally she decided, but she had to do it her way. And that's exactly what she did. And I was pretty impressed when I reread it this last couple weeks. I've read it 3 times in the past week, or listened to it.
I was absolutely shocked at how much this felt like a Greek mythology story. I never recognized that as a child. I did not connect those two. And this time it really felt that way to me, sort of the classic hero's journey. And there are parallels with Ged and his power that sort of get close to, Daedalus and the sun, getting a little too close to the sun with his wax wings in there. Some aspects of that with Ged's power. And I made connections this time that I didn't have the reference point probably for as a child, but it really spoke to me as an adult. So, I really enjoyed this.
I know when I first read it, I wasn't looking for anything, paying attention to anything. I was just reading it for the story itself. I was too young to even think about themes and stuff like that. I don't even know if I knew the concept at that time.
Right.
Before we get too much further into discussing A Wizard of Earthsea, got a couple of questions for Philip.
Okay.
Basically, when did you first realize you were a book reader, a lover of books? And what books? Yeah, how old were you, and what books made you realize that?
I was probably around 12. I was definitely a reader before then, but I remember reading Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain. And
that's how it's pronounced. Okay.
Really loving that series, which is very much inspired by the Welsh Mabinogion. And I thought, okay, as a kid, I think I wanted more fantasy. I'd been a comic book reader before that, And so that was comic books I was passionate about when I was younger. But I think it was Lloyd Alexander's series that made me think, I want more of this. And so I read Tolkien right around that age. That is where I absolutely just could not, I couldn't stop. I mean, I went through the door to Middle Earth and I never came back. So that was me as a kid. And Le Guin was soon after that. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I consider Tolkien and Le Guin to be my two biggest, most formative influences. Tolkien probably the biggest, but Le Guin is a second for me. And so, yeah, I mean, that was for me. My entire life after that has been trying to recapture that engagement of the imagination that I felt when I read The Lord of the Rings and Earthsea, and been fortunate to be able to find that in a lot of other series since.
C.S. Lewis was my introduction to fantasy, but I'm with you. It was when I finally was able to read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, because I had tried The Hobbit at a really young age and got 3 pages in and said, nope, went back and reread the Chronicles of Narnia, and then tried The Hobbit again and plowed right through it. The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. I didn't tackle the Silmarillion for a couple of years, but I was only 8 when I read the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So trying the Silmarillion at that time just was not within any reason. My parents convinced me of that. But parents. Yeah, Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings hooked me on fantasy. I remember being addicted to the Chronicles of Prydain. You said,
Prydain. Prydain. Yeah.
Okay, I always said Prydain.
Yeah, that's fine too. Yeah,
that was a series that I read a whole bunch, but I don't remember much of it. I remember Fluid or Flam. I think that's how his
yeah. The bard.
That name
right?
That name is stuck with me my whole life. That's another one that's been 40 years since I read.
Well, it's on our list. It's on our list, so we will be getting to that.
Oh wow!
Eventually. We're already
that's one that, unlike the Earthsea books, I think when you reread it, you'll think, oh, this is a nice series for kids,
yeah.
Whereas this speaks to the adult in me just as much as the kid in me, if not more.
Yeah.
I like what Bill said earlier, actually, about it reminding him of myth. I've always felt it was like folktale, that it was on a level like that, where there is an engagement with deep psychological aspects of just human nature, and that delving into it in a way through story, right? And I feel like Le Guin successfully plugs into some real fundamental aspects of being a human being in here and dealing with things like death and acceptance of death. And so, sorry, Bill, you were about to say something earlier.
Yeah, for me, I really discovered fantasy through Pierce Anthony and Xanth.
Oh, neat.
I was also reading Louis L'Amour because I loved Westerns at the same time. And my father noticed I was reading the two and went, you should try Stephen King's The Dark Towers. He hands me The Gunslinger.
Oh, yeah.
And it was the book that really ignited, and I went, I love reading. So, I enjoyed reading the other stuff, but I think I fell in love with The Gunslinger. So that's where mine started from.
Yeah, Dark Tower is phenomenal. Yeah, great stuff. Yeah.
You've got me actually considering reading it, and I'm not much of a Stephen King reader. I read a few of his and was honestly rather disappointed in what I read. But I love the movies, or several of the movies based on stuff of his. So after your series of reviews of The Dark Tower, I think I might end up reading that in the next couple of years here. I've got a really long TBR.
Oh, I know you do.
Everybody does.
We all do.
Yeah, common problem around here. Yeah.
When was the first time when was it you said that the first time you read this book?
I actually don't remember. I probably was a teenager. I can't honestly recall exactly when, but it was after Lord of the Rings. I can tell you that for sure. And I reread it in perhaps my 20s or late 20s, early 30s, and then the series as a whole. But A Wizard of Earthsea, I've actually read, I don't even know how many times, because I taught it in my fantasy novels course. So I might have read this book 5, 6, 7 times, I would guess, something like that.
Easily.
Yeah.
So it's like Wheel of Time with me. Gotcha.
Yeah. Well, Wheel of Time's slightly longer than this.
Yeah, but I keep rereading it.
When you first read it, were you picking up on themes, stuff like that at the time? Did it affect you much, or?
I think I was just bathing in the beauty of it when I was younger, and probably there was a bit of the mystery and the thrill and all of that, but I don't think I was consciously. I mean, it's funny because Le Guin tells you pretty much with the epigraph what the theme is right here. Yeah. I mean, only in silence the word, only in dark the light, only in dying life, bright the hawk's flight on the empty sky. There's a real yin-yang aspect to that. It's so gorgeous. That's just pure poetry.
It gave me chills.
Yeah. And there's a Taoist kind of message to that, I think, that is very much a part of where she's going in The Wizard of Earthsea.
Well, I think it's also there with the equilibrium they're always seeking. Yep. Understanding that
balance.
Your magic, what you do affects this world, and you better know how it's going to affect it. You need to have that balance and that equilibrium within the magic in the world.
Yep. But also the idea that death and life are intertwined, that you can't have one without the other. You can't have love without grief. And it's just like the yin yang symbol.
Shadow without light.
Exactly. No light without shadow, and all of it, et cetera, et cetera. You need the opposites in order to have the things that we cherish. So that is a lesson at the heart of this. It's at the heart of what Ged has to learn, really, I think, in his acceptance of not only life but of death. And there's just some incredibly beautiful moments that always appealed to me in here, where you have this sense of connection that just completely permeates this read, the sense of connection between our fellow beings with the world around us. There are several scenes, I think, where you really get that, where Ged shows up at Rogue and in this wizard school, and he's in the courtyard where the fountain is, and he feels just suddenly this oneness with everything. Mm-hmm. That happens again when the Otak Hoig wakes him up from after he tried to save Pechvari's son. He was in that kind of coma, if you will, but the animal instinctively knew what he needed and licked him until he woke up, and he understood. He gained this respect for his fellow creatures. I think that was a beautiful moment. So that kind of thing is all over here, and I love it.
He has a number
when he died, moments. That dagger to my heart was just brutal.
Oh, when Hoig dies, yeah.
Why would you do that to me? Come on, man.
Yeah. What? Le Guin, come on. This is an animal companion here. You're not supposed to.
Yeah, you don't do that.
You find them frozen in the snow. I'm like, dude, I would John Wick right after that. Be like, oh no, you killed my friend. It's on.
Yeah.
This book did a lot of, I don't know, my impression is she did a lot of things earlier than, before her time on fantasy. Like, she introduced Eastern philosophies into fantasy earlier than I remember seeing anybody else doing it. I think this is the earliest example of an animal companion that I know of, at least. I can't think of anything before 68 in fantasy. Of course, I read more science fiction before 68 than fantasy, so I'm not as familiar with old fantasy.
There must be something out there.
When did Star Beast come out? I don't remember the exact date, but it was around that time.
Yeah, that's science fiction, so that's fantasy. My definition of fantasy does include science fiction, so.
Yeah, for me, it's funny because I remember one of the things I remember about reading it when I was young was how much I identified with Ged, and I was so sure he was right, on his decisions. This time, the first half of the book just frustrated me. I had to ask myself why, and I sort of had to think back to my mindset as I was a young teenager and how frustrated I am as an adult with the decisions I made then. And I'm like, that's why I'm feeling this way, because I was exactly the same. It's the arrogance of youth. Thought I knew everything and I knew better. And that's why I'm feeling this way. It's not that Ged's different. It's that I'm different. And, just making that connection made it a little more tolerable. Because at first I'm like, God, he is so annoying right now. I'm like, that's why he's annoying me. He reminds me of me.
Yep. He's got that TEEN at teenager. He's too young to be anything but annoying. Because when you really get down to it, kids are annoying. I love children, but kids are annoying, including especially teenagers.
Okay, I got kids. You can't say
that. I could never teach high school because teenagers are just almost the worst.
The thing is, we were all teenagers once. That's the caveat.
I was never a teenager. Yeah. I went from 12 to 20. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, I've heard stories, Glenn. Don't hand me that, man.
It took me 8 years to do it, but I went from 12 to 20. So
yeah, but it's true though that Ged is in a way a classic hero, a protagonist, in that he is a bit arrogant and naive, and that leads to some very serious consequences. As you could argue, the whole reason he releases his shadow on the world is because of his pride and his arrogance and his insecurities.
And his own insecurities. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's what got me the most is he kept taking everything as an insult. And half the time, I'm not sure they were insults. I'm like, that.
Yeah, Jasper's not as bad as you thought when you were a kid, right?
Yeah. Exactly. I thought it was horrible. I'm like, he's not that bad. He didn't seem to get snarky until Ged kind of got snarky first. And it's like, okay, now it's a teenage thing and they're just going to butt heads.
Right.
But at first I'm like, I don't think he's being horrible.
When I reread it this past week or so, I was like, wait, is Ged an unreliable POV here? That because it's not so much the narrator, but it's his POV still. And is he just thinking Jasper is being an asshole with what he's saying, or
at first
is Jasper actually being an asshole? And I wasn't sure at first.
Bit of both.
But yeah, because I mean,
it's a mix.
As I mentioned to Bill earlier before we started recording, Jasper never gets his staff. He leaves. He never gets fully attained his role as a wizard or whatever. Is when you get the staff. I think that's what it was. Sorcerer and then wizard. So yeah, I wasn't sure how bad Jasper really was.
I believe Jasper did that by choice, though. He chose to become a sorceress in another kingdom.
Okay. The character I really liked was Vetch.
Well, when Vetch was telling him about him, the last he heard was that Jasper didn't get it. He had gone off to a kingdom to become a sorcerer for that kingdom, which, I guess he decided, in my mind, there were things in magic he didn't want to approach. He was afraid to approach, and he was okay with doing what he wanted to do. And sorcerer fit fine without becoming a wizard, which was probably a wise decision, especially for his age.
Yeah, that's an interesting read. I'd have to look at that again. I always assumed a little bit like Glenn. I think that he didn't get the staff because he wasn't up to snuff. But I think that's an interesting read, and you'd have to go back and look. Maybe he did it by choice, which would tell you that he is, you're right, more mature than Ged would have thought, right?
Right. I mean, that's how I read it, and I could be completely wrong. I could have misread a passage, which happens, and I just misinterpreted it.
Or it's ambiguous, and we're putting our own spin on it. So, yeah.
Which is the great thing about literature.
Yep.
We were talking about how pride in his insecurity is what led to his shadow being released. I'd also say he connected to it, or at least to wherever the shadow was from, because of his impatience. Mm-hmm. Back when, because what was it, Ogion's books he got into, and all of a sudden there was that shadow. I don't know for a fact that that's the same shadow that he later sees, but it seems like that was his first connection to the shadow.
I think it's a foreshadowing of that shadow. Yeah.
Yeah,
Nice.
and he did it to impress a girl, which shows
Yeah.
you the immaturity
Yeah.
there. At the same time, you're like, okay, you're getting into deep, dangerous territory, and for what?
Yeah, we know
Of
how that
course,
usually goes. Yeah.
yeah. Of course, when I was
But
his age, I probably would have done something equally as stupid to impress a girl. So
Yep. Yep.
I can't be too hard on.
and it's also the classic, apprentice, impatient to learn whatever, especially if it's something exciting like magic. You see it every time you see a master apprentice relationship. It seems the apprentice is always like, I want to know more, I want to know, no, teach me now, and they're always trying to go too fast. And it just the way Ogion started it out, not saying a word, taking him on the walk back to his place. And Ged's like, haven't learned anything, and you haven't figured out what I'm teaching.
Yeah.
And I think it was silence, and that I think he needed to listen.
But I think it's important to remember who he went to when he was stuck in his Sparrowhawk form.
Yeah.
He went back to him and and sat with him, was quiet. The teacher was patient with them. I mean, Ogion was quiet, just let him get his feet under him and everything, like a great, mentor should do when somebody is knocked that far off kilter. To me, he's kind of the Yoda of Earthsea. He's just calm,
Yeah.
he's patient, and I gotta say, he was probably one of my favorite characters. Just seemed
For me, it was
really
Vetch.
wise.
I
like
really
Vetch.
liked Vetch. And I can't get that picture of that character from Star Wars Andor named Vetch out of my head. Every time I hear the name Vetch, I just picture this huge, maybe not an alien, but just this big, huge hulk of a man. And I don't think that's how she described him. I'm not sure if she even
That
gave
big,
a description.
Yeah. I mean, he's big, but he's not that big.
Yeah, I just pictured a really big dude, and it's just.
And he's humanoid.
If I was to cat, yeah, as a human, obviously, but still somebody just really huge, and it was because I knew that name from somewhere, and I was like, wait, where did I see that name? And I'm like, give me a second. I did a little Googling. I'm like, that's where it was. It was a character on Andor.
Do they share any character traits? I mean, is he a loyal friend?
No, he's in one scene, and he was paid to stand there and be intimidating.
Be a big dumb fella, really. Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not caught up on Andor, so I'm like, maybe he was named Star Wars.
But going back to what Bill was saying about Ogion being the mentor figure, I think Le Guin has an interesting spin on it because Ged leaves him fairly quickly. And yet later, as you pointed out, when he goes back to him in his Falcon form, he recognizes, oh, you were actually my true master, even though he went off to Rogue to get all this training. So I agree that Ogion is an Obi-Wan Kenobi type. He's a Dumbledore, a Gandalf kind of figure, for sure in some respects. In other respects, he's absent much more than would normally be the case for that kind of figure. And you do get some kind of stand. You have Nemeril, who sacrifices himself in order to essentially save Ged and the world, perhaps, from the shadow. So he's also, I think, fulfilling that role to some degree. And you have and of course, Le Guin doing the wizard school thing long before Harry Potter or Game of the Wind or anything else. Here it is.
Feist.
Yeah. So a lot of mentor figures. Yeah.
Ged has an even more innate, and I don't know so much innate, but deep connection to Ogion, because Ogion's the one who named him.
Yes.
And in a world where your true name is such an important and powerful thing, that seems like that would be a really strong bond connection made between those two people, when that happens.
He's also the first one to point out to Ged, he hints to him about what this shadow actually is. He's the one that tells him, it knew your true name. How did it know? But how did it know? You need to go back to the beginning of where you got your true name. You need to go back at that point, I'm assuming he knows or suspects heavily that this shadow is part of Ged. And, rather than hand feed it to him, he just sort of leads him on that path to sort of self-discovery, which is just amazing.
Yeah. Remember how Ogion frowned when he learned the name of the boat that was going to take Ged, from Gond, away from Gond.
Shadow, yeah.
Shadow. I mean, if ever there's been foreshadowing, that right there is pretty heavy-handed. But like we said earlier, it's a kid's book, or at least YA, so kind of being heavy-handed at times is necessary, I think, especially with foreshadowing.
I love the idea of the what you were mentioning before too about names and the true name of something giving you some insight into its true essence. And that, of course, is a very ancient idea. And it's something you see a lot in fantasy. Le Guin does a wonderful job with it, but there are lots of other takes on that type of magic, naming kind of magic, like The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, right? There's a lot of that sort of thing in fantasy, but I love the idea of it. And so there's a linguistic foundation to the magical system in Earthsea that is pretty cool. The idea, though, that knowing something's true ancient name is, in a way, going back in time to its ultimate origins and understanding it that way. And then you have a true understanding of something. You can be in real communion with it. I just think that's really wonderful.
She did have a short story called The Rule of Names.
Yep.
And that
goes into that.
Yeah, that really sort of dives into that, at least from the plot summary. Like I said, I'm still trying to find an actual copy of those.
Yeah.
Sometimes short stories can be hard to find. Really hard to find.
She had two. She had it was The Rule of Names and The Word of Unbinding.
I think
I don't know if they're in this the collected Earthsea stories or not. I kind of thought they were. I just ordered it, actually.
They might be.
So they might be in that. That might be something.
Is that the big illustrated one?
Yeah.
I think I've got
I'll have to check that
somewhere on ebook.
I actually, my copy of it is coming soon. So I'll
looking forward to that.
Well, I'm like halfway through the second book because I was so excited when I finished the first one. So cool. I'm probably going to read that a couple times before our next, dive into.
I'm probably going to read
story.
book 2. I'm probably going to start book 2 sometime this weekend.
You guys are way ahead of me.
Maybe Monday or Tuesday after I finish editing Sunday night's video for What the Adaptation, because I'm reading the Earthsea books for this channel. We're doing The Expanse for What the Adaptation, so I'm rereading chapters of that parallel to the episode, and then I'm reading for myself. So I've got like 3-4 books going at any one time right now, and it just it keeps me busy. I don't spend hours on Twitter anymore. I broke that habit.
That's probably good.
One of the other things Ogion was introduced Ged to was, the connection. It might be a little vague, but the connection to nature. That whole conversation about what's this plant? I think it's forefoil or something like that. Yeah. And and respect for things for what they are, and not what you want them or expect them to be. Because Ged expected it to have some properties. What is it used for? What use does it have? And Ogion's none that I know of. But the plant was still important enough for Ged to be introduced to it. And so I think that's leading into the whole thing of, you seem to have a connection when you have to have a connection and an understanding of all of nature and everything around you before you make any kind of changes.
Well, that point was sort of further cemented when he had the discussion with the mage about the pebble and the diamond, where he goes into a pebble will ever be a pebble. And then it gets into the name incorporating in with the actual nature of something. So I think those flow together really well. And the way she weaves them in there is just brilliant. And I'm a little sad I didn't pick up on the brilliance as a younger reader when I was 13, but I'm happy I found it now. So
here's that quote. But you must not change one thing, one pebble, one grain of sand, until you know what good and evil will follow on that act. And then it goes on to talk about the equilibrium,
right,
and everything.
And then he lets a big old nasty shadow into the world.
Yeah.
Which really, the shadow is really just his dark nature, his darker side. And I don't think it's coincidence that once that was released and it injured him, he was sick, dying, and then was healed and recovered. He wasn't nearly as much of a little crap, shit as he had been before. And I think that's because a lot of the darkness left him. Because that's when I don't know, when I've read the last week, it really seems that's when his personality kind of shifts.
I agree that his personality shifts, but I think one of the things that he ultimately learns in the end, when he names the shadow Ged and it names him simultaneously, and you understand, it's been him all along. I think that this is part of, again, going back to that epigraph, that darkness is part of us. Yeah. It is an absolutely essential part of us, of what we are. And learning to accept that rather than to run away from it. Because remember, how much does he run away from this? It's only when he turns around and encounters it. It's like a dream. I'm sure you guys have had dreams like this. I have them all the time, where a monster is chasing me and I'm running away. And then I turn around and I face it in my dream, and that totally transforms everything. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. Is Ged he's turning around, encountering his fears, but it turns out that they're very much a part of who he is, and accepting that death is part of life, accepting that we are both light and shadow, is, I think, the ultimate thing that he has to embrace here at the end. And it's just beautifully, I think it's a wonderful metaphor.
Yeah. The acceptance of one's whole self, I think, was the overall point. And that darkness is a part of all of us. You can't be whole without that part as well. You may not like it, it may scare you, which is fine, but at the same time, it is a part of you, and you have to be able to accept that. And that's just a beautiful idea. And I kind of wish more kids would pick up on it now. And now I really want to push this book to younger readers.
Yeah,
definitely.
So, I mean, there are lessons in there that I didn't pick up on. I picked up on now and went, wow, if I'd only paid attention.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, though, that there's a slightly older style of storytelling, I think, in A Wizard of Earthsea, where it does feel like a folk tale or a myth. And a part of that is most modern readers of fantasy, not to speak of just kids, but modern readers of fantasy, expect a lot of action. They expect a lot of dialogue, and not as much of the exposition that you have and it's beautiful writing. It's just good. Don't get me wrong, I love it. It's gorgeous. But I think a lot of people who are more accustomed to modern fantasy would have a hard time adjusting to A Wizard of Earthsea, and would feel that it's harder to get through, because it's not that there are pages and pages without dialogue, and that's not something that modern readers are accustomed to.
I think found it
the Wheel of Time helped me with that.
Yeah.
For myself, I actually found it easier to get through than one of the things I remember, I didn't remember details of the story, but I remember I remember being frustrated when I was reading it when I was young. And I think I was frustrated there wasn't as much dialogue. And I totally understand what you mean about mine, but being more mature, I was able to deal with the less dialogue than usual. Now than when I was.
Well, of course, you and I, Glenn, are slightly older. I'm even older than you are. So we're.
He's a couple years, behind me, a year and a half behind me.
So you're the young one here, Bill.
Yeah, I get to be the baby. I don't hear that often. Not anymore.
No, not with that white in your beard.
Hey, I earned every gray hair I have.
Yeah, I avoid that by keeping it short enough that you can't see what color it is. But I have plenty of grays in here now. Yeah. But so it was a very different experience reading this, listening to this as an adult, and I'm sure some of that had to do with the audiobook than reading them as a kid. I actually remember more from the later books than from this one, but there is something to be said about what you're talking about. Modern readers of fantasy, they don't. People get into fantasy now with the stuff that's coming out now, and then you try to get them to read something like Lord of the Rings, and they can't do it
Exactly,
because it's an, I guess, an archaic style of writing now. I think it's old enough to be called archaic, but it's an out of fashion storytelling and prose style.
Well, I think what happened is screens that, first it was films and television, and now, of course, you have these gadgets everywhere, and the internet, and attention spans have famously gotten smaller. So
yes.
Readers tend to want action, dialogue, and the least amount of exposition possible. And this is an exposition-rich story with some gorgeous description, but readers don't have the patience for it these days. So.
Yeah, in my opinion, that's one of the things that makes it so gorgeous, though. I mean, the writing is just done so well. Some of the descriptions are just the kind of thing that hit you and sit with you, and you're like, wow, okay. Yeah, completely. You get that moment of total connection and recall of maybe feeling that way at some point in your life when you get into that narrative, and that feeling of that recall is what makes you so excited as a reader. You're like, oh, I know exactly how that feels. I remember how that feels, and you get that moment, and I live for that. So yeah, man, bring it. I'll take exposition all day long if it's going to bring me that kind of joy. I love it.
Yeah.
And I'd say Le Guin is a master of prose. I mean,
agreed.
With so little, she says more than most people. Daniel Green had a video not too long ago where I guess he had made a tweet comparing or retweeted something comparing Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, the way he describes a room, and the way Ursula Le Guin does in this book. And it's like massive, long 2-3 paragraphs, minimal 1 or 2 sentences, And it's just like, and I guess it started a war on his Twitter timeline,
of course,
because people weren't happy that he made, he was doing that comparison between the two.
But they're different styles. It's not that big of a deal. Writers have different
really
styles.
Good prose.
It's okay.
It's very efficient prose. She's very efficient with her use of words.
She would
have loved. I think she really would have loved communicating on Twitter. I think she could have would have been a master at writing tweets.
Yeah. Not many characters, but definitely gets her point across. I think for me, this sort of reawakened my love for that inner dialogue that I haven't had in a while, because I have been reading more modern stuff, and I'm not getting a lot of introspection from characters so much as I'm getting.
It's a meditation. It's like a meditation.
Yeah, it's what it felt like. And it was amazing. And I enjoyed it way more than I thought I would. Way more than I thought I would. And that's why I started the second book almost immediately. I'm like, oh no, we're going to keep going.
The last thing I read that had this much internal dialogue was Dune, which I read last year for my other channel. That's like a third of the book seems to be internal dialogue. Maybe not quite that much, but there's a lot of it. There is a lot of it in Dune, which is a classic fantasy novel.
Yeah, I read Dune every year. So,
what were some other themes that you noticed, Bill?
I think we pretty much covered them. Like I said, one is the arrogance of youth for the first half of the book. You definitely get a little bit of that. The folly of not knowing yourself, impatience. You get things like that in the first half. The second half is sort of acceptance of life, death, balance, order. You need those things in order to do that. And then finally, that reconciliation with oneself is important, to recognize all aspects of who you are, including the darkness, including that annoying little power hungry teenager you might have been. You need to accept that. So that's what I basically took from it. There's a bunch. So
yeah, that's beautifully said, I think. Yeah.
What about you, Glenn?
Well, the first one that I know, so we've kind of touched on it, is, we've talked about the pride, but also, he had a lot of anger and rage when he was young. He was, and even some hate, especially towards Jasper. And that led to foolish and even harmful behavior, like when he had that duel that they weren't supposed to have. That was all stemming from not just his pride, but from his hatred. He was on the dark side kind of there for a while in some ways. I did notice one.
Just to dwell on that, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
To dwell on that for a moment, where do you think that comes from? I mean, he did have a very troubled relationship with his father, who was
no mother,
bit of a bully, and he had no mother, and he had a pretty exploitative aunt. So
she wasn't that nice.
I mean,
Le Guin doesn't. She was kind to him.
No, not kind at all. She tried to use him, really. Le Guin doesn't get into really psychoanalyzing the characters a whole lot, but if you think about a kid growing up with a fairly abusive father, no mother, kind of exploitative aunt, would see the world as a place of competition, with having to prove yourself, with having to survive. So it's almost understandable that he comes to first Ojian with no patience whatsoever, and then to Roke basically looking at everybody as a potential rival, except for Vetch, who I think he learns a lot of humanity from Vetch and Vetch's kindness. That's a pretty key relationship there, I think.
For me, I'd have to say there's sort of two factors that go into his psychology. His family life, yes, his father was abusive, was determined to make him live his path instead of his own. His aunt absolutely didn't even bother with him until she found out he had magic. And his first major act of magic led to violence, and he got praise for it. And I think that set right there in his head, okay, this is my thing. This is how, how I become what I want to be, the power. So I think
he became addicted to the power when he learned how to call animals to him.
Yeah.
His aunt's teachings addicted him to power. It scared him at first when the sheep just wouldn't leave him alone. But, when he learned how to call different birds to him all the time, I think that really solidified his sense of that. Probably there is where he became prideful. Yeah. And then especially after he did use the fog to defend the town.
So
which reminds me.
Go ahead, Glenn.
I was going to say, that reminds me, one thing that she does, and a lot of people make this mistake, especially the people who did the casting for a sci-fi channel movie based on Earthsea. They made a big mistake because they didn't pay attention to her descriptions. And I like how she never at first describes Ged. She describes Ged by describing the other people. She described Ged by having the invading people on their island be pale with long yellow hair. Very, it is a contrast. And then she compares, by describing other people around Ged, but not, from the same areas as Ged, but not Ged himself. I don't think she ever once says in the story, maybe there is a line where about him being red-brown.
Right.
But that's late in the story.
When he meets Vex.
Not at the beginning. But so many people fall into the same trap of reading fantasy, especially people in the Western world, as we call it, thinking these characters are white. And that is so clearly not the case with the Earthsea books. I mean, there are white characters that show up, but everybody, that's the first cover I've seen where somebody wasn't white, was non-white. Most of the times I see fantasy covers, everybody's white. And I liked how that she changed that with this,
Yeah, she did it very deliberately. Yeah.
And for the time this book was published, I mean, that was pretty gutsy. You're going to get a lot of pushback, especially from the industry at that time.
Yeah.
Good.
A key moment that we haven't talked about yet, and I think it's a nice moment because it shows Ged's progression from a moral standpoint, is when he saves the people of the 90 isles, or however many isles there are there, from the dragon, Yavaug. Right. It turns out he figures out its name. What I like about that whole thing is, first, it's super cool how he goes there and
any dragon battle was awesome.
Yeah, and the dragon battle and Pendor and all that. But I also love the fact that you see moral progression here. He doesn't just run away from these people. He feels, I have an obligation to help them before I can leave. And so he sets out and he does that, knowing he could die, encountering, he's taking a gamble, thinking, maybe this is Yavaug. I don't know. I'm taking a wild guess here. It works out in his favor. But I love the fact that he does this out of a sense of moral obligation. And it shows some progression in his character arc, where later, I think where we're going to, and he does run from his shadow, so he still has a lot to learn. He has that whole awful thing that happens in Osskill where he loses Hoig and everything else, and that's also very much let's call it a learning experience. But at some point, he turns around and he decides, rather than be the hunted, he becomes the hunter, and he finally, basically what happens at the end is this whole place where they go out so far out in the ocean that it becomes another realm. It's the realm of death. He's encountering the shadow in the realm of death itself and accepting it as part of himself.
I think for me, one of the pivotal moments for me was when he was with Vetch and his family, and he's looking at this other 19-year-old, and he's admiring this 19-year-old's life while that kid is doing the same thing to him. And that kind of moment where they can look at each other's lives and both sort of see what they want to be, but just admire the other person for what they are. I think, to me, that is a clarifying moment for Ged, and to me it really sang about how much he had grown. So that was a pivotal moment for me.
Another pivotal moment, I would say, would be what's the name of that stone at the castle? Sarah wanted him to touch and talk to that, something like that, Ternarian or something like that. That, the fact that he resisted that temptation,
good one,
was a big step for him. Because if it had been 2 chapters before, he'd have had his hand on that stone and been talking to that stone like nothing else.
That's a great point.
Well, I think the dragon,
that was a big step.
I think the dragon actually led to that progression, because the dragon was the first one to offer him, I can tell you what its name is.
The shadow's name.
Ged rejects it.
That's
he says no. So I think
that's another temptation.
Yeah, I think that gave him the foundation to be able to withstand the temptation of the stone. So for me, they're kind of lockstep together. But it definitely shows, he's growing, he's maturing, he's accepting responsibility. He's also starting to realize there are consequences, and I cannot just do what I want. And that is a huge thing, especially when you're coming out of your teenage years, that moment when you go, wow, I can't do this. I can't be like that.
I love how you mentioned that just now, because I just scrolled down further in my notes, and at the top of my notes here is beware of unintended consequences. And then you just all of a sudden mentioned consequences. Yeah, he really did have to learn, like that quote I read earlier about knowing, what's going to happen. You can't change anything without knowing what the results will be, and not just the immediate results, but secondary and tertiary and long-running results. It's like changing into another form. Yeah, it sounds like fun and games, and it's useful when you can change into a dragon to fight other dragons. But you can't stay in that form for too long, or you lose yourself.
Like he did when he fled, right? Yeah. When he fled, and Ogian had to wake him up again.
Yep, bring him back.
Which he could only do because he knew his true name. So
that's become a classic trope in fantasy where you can change, characters that can change form, they always have to worry about not truly becoming whatever they changed into. Which, wouldn't be so bad if you had changed into a dragon and then forgot to change back. Being a dragon forever might be kind of fun.
It'd be tough to fit into your pants, though.
I'm like, yeah, man, I don't know about that. There are consequences. You're a dragon.
Who needs pants? You're a dragon. Who needs pants?
The people you live with are going to want to stay with you any longer.
We'll clear out the barn. I'll live in the barn. Nobody will mess with the house, though. They know a dragon lives here.
That's true. Everyone would stay away.
Yeah. Or the government's going to take you and experiment like crazy because there's a dragon.
True.
Right. That would be fun, though.
Yeah.
It would be the least bad of all the forms you could get stuck in.
We need to work on your idea.
Because at least a dragon is intelligent, can think and talk.
Yeah,
depends on the dragon.
They can. Yeah.
It depends on the dragon.
Interestingly, the dragons speak the language of magic as their native tongue. I think that's a really cool thing. And they can lie in that language, but humans can't.
Yeah.
So humans are bound by that language in some way. Yeah, that's a great little touch. I like that.
You know what? In my head, I'm like, oh, dragons are Aes Sedai. They can say the truth without saying the truth. In my head, that's how the magic works. Yeah, they can very much sort of find the back ways of doing things.
Yeah, it tells you too. I think there's a connection between humans and dragons that I find interesting.
Yeah. It's got to be a common ancestor or crossover point somewhere.
Oh, I am definitely looking forward to reading the next 3. And then after that, I'll read the other 2 that I've never read. So I don't even know the names of those 2. I hear they're good, though. She published them a lot after a long time after The Farthest Shore. I think it was a good 20 years.
Yeah, Tehanu I've read. That's the 4th one. And then the others are more recent, and I haven't read them. So yeah, they're the 5th one I haven't read. It's something about the short story collection. I feel like the word wind is in the title or something, or that might be the 5th book. But yeah, we'll have to get there.
I'll have to look for that, definitely.
I think I'm going to have to order the complete Earthsea collection. So.
Get the illustrated one. That's what I've got in ebook. When I can afford it, I'm going to get a hard copy of it. But
yeah,
it's got some nice illustrations in there. Not a lot of illustrations. At least I've only seen a handful. But
yeah, I just bought it. It's I can't wait for it.
That's the one you're looking forward to.
I was hoping it would be here for this, but I had my old tattered copy of Wizard of Earth.
It should be here for the next one in 3 weeks. So we discuss what book 2 is, the Tombs of Atuan.
Tombs of Atuan.
That's Atuan. So we're looking forward to that. When was the first time in this story that you realized the Shadow's name was Ged?
Oh, well, the first time I read it, I didn't know until the end. But then
I had forgotten.
Oh, okay.
I had forgotten because it had been so long. I didn't remember many details. For me, it was when the Shadow used the fog on Ged. Used Ged's trick from the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
And just knowing ahead of time what she was doing with the story in some aspects, and knowing that everything had that it wasn't all just surface, like when I first read it, that there are layers that go pretty deep. I'm like, that's suspicious, and that had me thinking it. I wasn't sure until later, but that was the first point where I started being suspicious that was the case.
For me, it was when Ojian told him, "How did it know your name?" I find that odd. That was what he said, and I'm like, how would he know his name? And then I started thinking, because he is him or a part of him. Okay, this is starting to make sense, and that's why he told him to go back to the beginning. So that's when I picked up on, I think this might be actually a part of him. Our basic last question is always, would you recommend this to young and older readers, or just one of that set?
I would recommend it to the whole world.
Me too.
Yeah. No, I
have your daughters read it?
I've had my daughters read it, and they're of the younger generation, so they tend to like a quicker pace, I think. But I could say that my older daughter, I think, got a lot out of it, and the younger one's certainly at an age where I think she'd appreciate it more too. So I'll see if I can get her to read it again.
So definitely a good case for all ages.
Did they ever do like a comic book adaptation of this? Because I mean, I could sort of see them doing this. They could set up the panels.
I seem to think
at a
they
little
did
bit
a
of a
graphic.
faster
I seem
pace.
to think they did. I'm pretty sure they did.
I know they did a
seen
cartoon.
it, though.
They did Studio Ghibli did
did an
Tales of
anime.
Earthsea. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they ever did comic book or graphic novel, and I think that would really work.
Thank you for coming on. Looking forward to chatting with you in a couple of weeks. I learned so much watching you, and just even talking to you so much more enjoyable. It gets out the whole thing I get when I'm typing like 100 million comments on your videos sometimes.
I love your comments.
I love the intercourse. I love chatting with you. It's a wonderful time. So we will be back in 3 weeks with the Tombs of Atuan. Thank you for watching at home, and don't forget to be awesome.
All right.